My name is Brian Soublé. I'm Assistant Chief Counsel here at the Department of Motor Vehicles. I'd like to welcome you all to our workshop for the regulations being developed for the non-testing operation of autonomous vehicles on public streets in California. On March 6, last Tuesday, we noticed the changed text for the testing regulations. This workshop will not be covering that changed text. Please submit any comments that you have on those regulations by March 21st. There are some instructions on the notice that went out on where to submit those comments. These regulations today are being developed pursuant to Vehicle Code Section 38750, which was enacted pursuant to SB 1298. We've posted an agenda for the workshop online, as well as an outline of what we're thinking about for the regulations. We have additional copies of the agenda in the back of the room. If you don't already have one, I'd suggest that you get one. The workshop is also being webcast and is being transcribed. So for the benefit of our viewers on the web as well as our court reporter, when you wish to talk, please step up closely to the microphone so that we can get everything that you're saying in the broadcast. We'd also like you to state your name, and if you're with an organization, the name of your organization, spelling your last name for our reporter. With me here at the table, I have Bernard Soriano. He is one of our project sponsors, and he's going to provide some more information about some of the webcasting that we're doing today.
So, hello everyone. For those of you that are looking at us over the internet, if you want to participate, we'll be taking your comments and questions over Twitter. And so if you want to tweet at CA_DMV and use hashtag #DrivingChange, we'll be able to see that, and we'll be able to read your comments on during the webcast here, and we'll be able to record it. So feel free to participate via Twitter. For those of you that choose to participate via Google Hangout, we've set up a Hangout, and the link to that Hangout can be found on our Twitter page as well as on our Facebook page and our LinkedIn account. So several ways for you to join the Hangout and participate as well. We'll be looking at the comments that you provide on the Hangout. So we look forward to having you participate virtually.
One of the things that we noticed when we were working on our first set of regulations is that this type of a workshop really benefited us because we were able to talk with the industry as well as other interested parties and get some of their ideas about what should go into the actual text of the regulations. So our hope again is that we can basically mirror that success and get comments from all of you that are participating on things that you believe we should be including in our next set of regulations as we embark on drafting them. As you can see from our outline, we do anticipate that this second set of regulations will also require an application process that is required by the statute. And so some of the things that will probably have to be covered are things like operator knowledge and skill requirements, insurance requirements and certifications, safety standards, and various registration requirements. We appreciate your participation in our session this morning. Our hope that the participation will assist us in drafting the regs, as I mentioned earlier. With that in mind, this is a workshop. It's not a substitute for participating in the formal rulemaking process, which will be initiated after we draft the regulations and post them for a 45-day comment period. The first thing on our agenda this morning is introductions, so I'm going to start here at the head table. Again, I'm Brian Soublé, and Bernard?
Bernard Soriano, one of the project sponsors on this.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And Stephanie Doherty, one of the project sponsors.
Kristen?
Kristen Tripke, Policy Chief with the DMV Licensing and Operations Division.
Now, I'm not going to necessarily go around the room, but what I would like you to do is as you make a comment, again, please introduce yourself, spell your name for the reporter, and if you're with an organization, tell us the organization that you're here with. On our housekeeping items, when you came into the room this morning, there was the copy of the agenda in the back of the room. If you need, the restrooms are located in the hallways outside of the back of the room. When you entered the building this morning, you were given a visitor badge. This is a secure building. And so if you have to wander around, please refrain from doing so. I'm sure the security guards will be very happy for that. There's no food or drink in the assembly room. And depending on how long our session goes today, we will probably take a break for lunch. There's a cafeteria down on the first floor. However, that cafeteria is geared up to serve about the 3,500 employees here at the DMV headquarters campus. So for the sake of time, you may want to think about one of the other lunch or restaurants that are located in the streets nearby. We're going to pattern our discussion this morning on the outline. So at this time, we're going to jump right into that. The items on the outline reflect our interpretation of the requirements of Vehicle Code Section 38750 for the operation of autonomous vehicles in a non-testing mode. That includes the operation of vehicles by end users or purchasers. At the outset, I mentioned that we were going to have an application process, and part of that process is coming up with definitions of specific terms. The Vehicle Code defines an operator as a person who is seated in the driver's seat, or if there is no person in the driver's seat, causes the autonomous technology to engage. The subsection E2 of Vehicle Code Section 38750 says that we may impose additional requirements that we deem necessary to ensure safe operation of autonomous vehicles, including whether that would require the presence of a driver in the driver's seat, based on the information that is submitted in the application that's filed with us. With all that in mind, we're wondering if the statutory definition of what an operator is sufficient. Do we need to add anything in the event that the department makes a determination that a specific manufacturer's application does not provide sufficient information to make a determination that it's safe to operate a vehicle without a driver in the driver's seat? And with that, I'd like to open our discussion on the terms that we have stated in the outline are the definitional phrases. The first one being, is that definition of an operator sufficient, or do we need to add anything to that? So with that, I'd like to open and ask if anybody has any comments on that subject. Okay. All right, I guess we're free to do whatever we want with that subject. One of the other requirements that is in the vehicle code is
So
that.
Brian, can I
I'm
just,
sorry.
I know that the legislation says for a fully autonomous vehicle without a driver, that it's the person that puts the vehicle in operation is that person. But, I mean, in thinking about the future world where there may not be any driver, and the way in which a vehicle that gets set into operation may be more automated and automated as time goes along. I mean, is the role of the operator in terms of the definition and the regulation for this have a specific purpose in terms of what the responsibilities are as the person who you're mentioning here might be? What would that, could you explain what you think the responsibilities would be as a result of having this definition?
Well, then you start delving into a lot of other issues that are associated with the operation of a vehicle. For example, if there's an accident, who's responsible for doing the reporting, especially if it's a completely autonomous vehicle? There are some provisions in the code that requires, the exchange of information. If there's a traffic violation, and we're jumping a little bit ahead on the outline,
Right.
but who's responsible for the points if an autonomous vehicle runs a light? And so, and you also mentioned the fact that as the technology develops and changes, would we be stuck with a definition that doesn't necessarily meet what would be necessary in the future, maybe 2 years now, 3 years from now? And so, should the definition be as broader than what's in the statute, or should we even think of restricting it somewhat?
So I was just wondering about whether the because I mean, we will get into this a little bit later, right? When you mention the fact that we figure out who gets the ticket, or who gets the citation, and who interacts, and I think there is kind of a discussion that needs to happen around that, right? So that the fact that a person, if it's defined as a human person and not a corporation, I think that's what we're really wondering about, whether even in this definition does operator, and when it talks about a person, does the person mean a human individual, or can it mean something more? I mean, it would seem to me that in the future, it might mean something different, right?
Well, right. I mean, if you look at the definitions, the common definitions that are in the vehicle code, a person includes a corporation and a partnership and other forms of entities. And so when we think of a vehicle being operated, is it that inclusive? Is the operator that person that could be a corporation?
Right. So the idea of kind of how you define it in the regulation I think would be important to make sure it stays as flexible and anticipates the future as much as possible, so that it doesn't refer to a person in the humankind, at least. And it sounds like the vehicle code has a definition that allows flexibility, which I think may work, right?
It may.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you have some other suggestions. I mean, that's the whole purpose of the
Right,
workshop.
right.
If anyone has any suggestions on that. For example, if you have a suggestion on an additional verbiage that we might want to use for operator. Anyone?
Okay, yeah.
Please go ahead. Pull the microphone close to you.
I'm John Simpson. I'm with Consumer Watchdog, and I just wanted to respond a little bit with what
Go right
you
ahead.
said there. I'm not sure that you want to provide maximum flexibility. It seems to me when you're talking about this sort of thing, you want to have a pretty good idea of what you're allowing and not allowing. And to sort of say, well, we want to be able to do anything and be maximally flexible causes a little bit of concern for me. That's not my primary issue here, but just in the background, I worry about that notion, just sort of an open-ended, let's be completely flexible. We don't know what we're going to do today, we don't know what we're going to do tomorrow, so we'll be flexible about everything. I'm aware of the notion that trying to regulate things stifles competition, innovation, I'm sorry. But I think when you're in the area of cutting-edge technology, it's better to go slow and be constrained rather than flexible.
And so you would envision that flexibility would come, and that if in the future you need to change, you just amend the regulation.
Right, you have, that's what a formal rulemaking procedure is all about. You do it with a completely transparent process, and it's worked pretty well.
Okay.
Well, I certainly didn't refer to, I didn't really mean to indicate that being flexible was in some way careless or not careful, but just envisioning the fact that the sort of the constraints of the ideas that we have in our head at this moment about what that future looks like is kind of difficult. And I think that the flexibility just means that doesn't mean that you give away any of the responsibility for safety or responsibility for doing the right thing, but simply that it doesn't kind of create a meaning that doesn't allow the kind of development that needs to happen. I think that was my point, really.
Okay. The other thought about that is that in, if we are too constrained in the definition, and we talked about, thwarting innovation, the problem may be that we have created something that even if we go to an additional rulemaking process, it takes about a year to get a regulation done. And so then you'd have to have that waiting period as you're going through that whole developmental process. So it's not that we want to be completely flexible, but we also want to keep in mind that in order to make changes, it would take time to make changes, and it looks like this is an area of technology that seems to be developing rather rapidly. And so, what we're trying to guide ourselves by is how can we address the fact that there are things that may be available a year from now that we're not even aware of today as we, embark on doing the regulations. So, go right ahead.
Good morning, Brian. Dan Frakes with General Motors. Just a quick question on the surface in terms of your definitions of operator, both in a vehicle or not in a vehicle, on the surface seem reasonable. Just a level set for me for the day. When we're talking about an autonomous vehicle, are we referring to the definitions that were created under the testing scenario?
Well, the definitions under the testing scenario are based on what's in the statute. And so while we hadn't necessarily discussed that, it's probably the same definitions that we're going to have to work from in the future, because that's what our statute, that's what our authority branches from. So I know there's a lot of discussion about whether or not we talk about the SAE levels or
Right.
the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration levels, but we've tried to stray away from using those types of definitions because they're not necessarily in our statute.
Okay. So for today, we'll assume that we're going to start with the testing definitions, and then to Ron's point, if we, as we grow with this technology and this experience, that, there could be the flexibilities to look at other definitions, whether it's SAE or NHTSA as this progresses.
That's correct. I mean, we always, the unspoken thing is the fact that NHTSA may at some point in the future develop standards.
Correct.
And then we'd have to look and see whether or not we need to make changes based on what are the federally developed standards. Well, right now, we're kind of in that netherworld where we don't necessarily have any federally mandated standards.
Yeah.
And we've had to come up with a regulation by January 1, so.
Okay. All right,
Excellent.
thank you.
Excellent question, thank you. One of the other items that we had when we started talking about defining of terms is the statute requires some capability for the vehicle to come to a complete stop. And depending on the circumstances is what does the phrase like complete stop mean? And how do you start trying to gauge when it's safe for a vehicle to come to a complete stop? I once heard an example, is it safe for a car in one of the Caldecott tunnel bores, if something goes wrong, to just stop right there and then hold up barrier commute traffic? And so that's one of those concepts and one of those phrases that we're struggling with. How do we define, for a vehicle that may be operating even without a driver inside, what's safe for it to come to a complete stop? We'd like to get your thoughts on that. Okay, the only way we're going to be able to work and actually get the regulations done is if we get some.
We got some.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Barbara Wendling with Volkswagen. There are rules already in the automotive industry for safe stop or fail-safe type operation. You have them in emissions already, things called limp home, where the vehicle might go into a reduced, lower speed operation that will allow a driver to safely move it off the road and get it through a tunnel, for example. Depending on the level of system you're talking about, you may have different ways of doing a fail-safe state. So this would be an area where I think we would want maximum flexibility while we're developing the technology, because it's still in the innovation phase.
Well, you raise a good point, which was depending on the levels, what's safe for the vehicle, and you also mentioned that there are some existing standards. If you can, at some point, you might have the email address for the regulations page on the bottom of the agenda. If you can send a site to that for us, that would be very helpful. But the suggestion there being that maybe what is defined as a safe stop is based on the level of the autonomous technology, and maybe even the interaction of the driver in the vehicle. Does anyone have any comments on something like that?
It also might be the environment in which it's going to stop, right? So not every operating environment coming to a complete stop in a lane of traffic would have the same potential consequences. So I think that, what Barbara said is something we ascribe to. I think we need some amount of understanding and flexibility as the technology is developed about exactly how that is going to operate. And so I don't think, the idea of failing in a way that's is safe and comes to a stop is kind of in the legislation, and I think that's something we certainly support. But I think that being careful not to find a definition that may not work for every circumstance, and you should be careful about that, right?
Well, I think since the statute requires us to get a certification that standard can be met,
Yes, right.
then whenever you start talking about a standard, you probably have to define it and have to put some parameters on what the standard itself is. And so since it is something that we're going to have to require, I guess what the question is what are people's thoughts about what we should be doing, what we should be looking for? It's something that's going to be on an application and a certification that's going to have to be made. And so what type of information should we obtain from you when we're looking at an application to assure ourselves that the certification that you're making is actually something that's safe for the public? Thoughts? Go ahead, John.
John Simpson, Consumer Watchdog. Would it be helpful to, instead of thinking about the term complete stop, be thinking about the term safe stop? And that would sort of get to the notion that in different circumstances, there's a different sort of stop that's required.
Well, actually, you're not necessarily stopping completely, but you may
Completely,
be
I
moving
mean,
to
a safe stop might be pulling over to the side of the road and going slowly for a while before you completely stop. I mean, it just seems to me to be more helpful of thinking of the term of safe rather than complete. And then I suppose something else that relates to that is the notion of disengaging the driverless technology. That seems to me to be all wrapped up into one. And in some sense, to me, that's what complete stop in this short words here kind of connotates those bigger concepts.
Okay, so you may, instead of thinking in the words of a stop, more in the words of moving into a more safe operating mode?
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
and in certain circumstances, a complete stop would be the right course. But, you know, the broader concept of implementing some new state safely is I think, what really is necessary to think about.
Right, because the thing that we're thinking, when you start thinking about the different levels of autonomy and the different levels of awareness of what's going on, I think it's going to be judged by what the specific circumstances are that are around the vehicle and the awareness of, in the instance where you have a person sitting in the driver's seat, are they capable of taking control of the vehicle? And does complete stop mean that that person has to take over? Or what if it's a medical issue with respect to the driver and the driver is incapable of it? Should we consider things like that when we start talking about getting the vehicle into a more safe operating mode? I guess we're going to like all of my ideas because we're not getting.
So I think, I mean, I don't have any specific idea here other than, you know, the words in the statute really are come to a complete stop, and this isn't a failure, which, you know, I think Barbara was mentioning, you know, in some failures that are detected, the vehicle can be put into limp mode and can limp to a safe place and stop. I think was one of the references that she was making, but there will be some failures that may not allow that to happen. So the only thing is that sometimes the only thing you might be able to do is to stop, right? So. Mm-hmm. And so I think trying to be more specific in the regulation has to take into account the various situations that vehicles are going to encounter and the environments they're going to operate in, so that trying to write one kind of specific requirement in a standard like this, in a definition of what it means, could be have unintended consequences, right? That aren't been met. Sometimes vehicles today that fail just come to a complete stop, and that's the only thing that they can do because there's just no other alternative. So I think we have to keep in mind what's possible and what isn't possible, and I think that all these technologies, any technology, will fail, and sometimes the way in which they behave toward the failure is going to depend on lots of things, including the environment. So I think that's the only caution I have, is to be aware of that, right?
Right. I mean, 'cause you wouldn't necessarily want a vehicle coming to a complete stop in the flow lane of a highway during commute hour. And so I think what we also have to consider when we start talking about it getting into a safe mode to make a complete stop is the conditions under which that's occurring.
I understand.
Yeah, Brian, Ross Good from Chrysler.
Can you step up to the mic? Thanks.
Ross Good from Chrysler. The idea of a complete stop's in the statute. I mean, we got to live with that, right? That's not so interesting. What's interesting is the process to come to a complete stop. I think that's where you guys should focus the regulation on, the process required to come to a complete stop, which gets you to your end, and that describes the whole bunch of different processes that other people have been talking about.
Thank you, Ross.
Dan Frakes with General Motors. Just to follow up on the conversation on this topic, what we've seen in talking with other states that have passed regulations for testing of autonomous vehicles in terms of coming to a complete stop, some ideas that have been thrown out there was, gradual deceleration to a complete stop within the lane. That seems like a fairly reasonable request. It's a better scenario than we have today if someone is incapable of handling their car, potentially with a health scenario. So that sort of, at least initial idea, could be a good starting point.
Okay. Anyone else? Go ahead.
We received a comment via the Google Hangout that regulations might be specific to the road type. So for example, in a tunnel situation, we would specify that you could not come to complete stop in the tunnel, where in another scenario, on a different road type, we would allow for an alternate minimal risk state.
Barbara Wendling, excuse me, Barbara Wendling with Volkswagen. I think what we just heard, though, is that depending on the application and the system, it may not be possible to limp it off the road in the failure. So as we just heard, the minimum requirement of coming to a controlled, safe stop in the lane is probably appropriate, and whatever we do beyond that will be, you know, application and failure specific, probably, so.
All right, thank you. One of the things that we've been seeing, and there's a lot of stuff on the internet with what I have described as a parking valet, you know, like maybe one of the first operations that we see of a completely autonomous vehicle is a vehicle that, you know, the driver gets out, presses an app or a key fob or something, and the car goes off and parks itself. And one of the things that we're wondering is that something that we should be defining as if you think about it, it's not a completely autonomous vehicle because it's not driving under all conditions, it's driving under some controlled settings. And so is that something that we should consider defining and then putting some standards? You know, for example, should the vehicle have to travel at a specific speed? I could just imagine a car creeping along at a mile an hour in a parking lot at 8 o'clock in the morning where everybody else is trying to get in and get to work. So should we, and what I'm soliciting is your thoughts on is something like that, these type of parking valet systems, is it something that we should concern ourselves with defining, which would be a definition that was somewhat different than what we would think as a completely autonomous vehicle? Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah, sorry, Barbara Wendling, Volkswagen. I did actually chair the SA committee that did the definitions for them, so I have sort of strong opinions on this, but I think SAE would say that the system you're describing where a person gets out and it's line of sight, they're watching the vehicle, and they are in fact responsible for making sure there's no person or anything in the path of the vehicle when they do this operation, is not autonomous or automated vehicle mode. When we talk about automated vehicles, at least in SAE, it's where the vehicle is performing the entire dynamic driving task. So they're doing everything but the strategic operations of deciding where the vehicle will go, where it's going to stop on the way, et cetera. But it does all the tactical and operational part of driving. And in that case, it would include object and event detection and response. You know, if it was doing the entire dynamic driving task. In the parking application you're talking about, the vehicle is not doing all of the object and event detection response, ergo it's not an automated vehicle in that sense. So we would argue out of scope. But
I'm not sure about that, because the way our statute defines an automated vehicle is that it can operate without you know, a driver either monitoring it or having the actual physical control of the vehicle. And so if I think of a vehicle that can operate even in a parking lot setting, it wouldn't have a driver in it. And it would be doing some driving functions without either a person in it actually able to take control. So under our statute, it would fit the definition of an autonomous vehicle, and therefore something that we would have to contemplate in our regulations.
it really depends on how the app is designed, but I think the one that I understood you to mean, where the person is standing next to the vehicle and watching it and holding a button, you know, on some kind of remote control, and watching it while it parks and lets go, it stops, you know, kind of thing. That's teleoperation, line of sight, and the operator is doing object and event detection and response, not the vehicle. So it's, I would say again, that's not automated within the, you know, the true sense of where the machine is performing the entire dynamic driving task.
Barbara, what about the situation where you press a button either on your smartphone or your fob and walk away, and the vehicle finds a parking spot and parks itself?
That would be an automated application, absolutely, because then it's doing the entire dynamic driving task, including object and event detection and response. So yes, I would agree, that's a different app.
And we are making a distinction. You know, there's a lot of technology that's available today where it's more of a park assist. You know, the vehicle can take over while you're sitting in it and doing the parallel parking. That's not what we're thinking of. We're thinking of more of the example that Bernard just gave, that you press a fob and walk away. You press an app and walk away. You press an app when you come back, and the car actually comes back to you without a driver in it.
Yeah, that's rather different than what I think you've heard about in the press recently, where you standing outside of it, you're watching the vehicle, and you press a button. It's just so that you don't have to open the doors when you're in a tight spot kind of thing, so. Difference, but.
Okay.
John Tillman, Mercedes-Benz. I think when you start talking about autonomous valet functions, there is a possibility when cars are going to come out on the market where they'll have different levels of autonomous driving. A car will have autonomous valet functionality, but it won't have anything else. They'll have functionality where the vehicle can park itself, in a parallel parking situation, but may not have autonomous valet functionalities. There may be also a situation where you are not just parking in the car autonomously, but you're actually standing at the curb with your groceries, hitting a button, and the car is unparking itself, coming over to where you're at, which is a different functionality on the valet system. But if we're going to bring cars to the market that have different levels of functionality, such as fully autonomous freeway, fully autonomous city, but not necessarily autonomous freeway or fully autonomous valet, you need to define those different levels of functionality that could come to the market without other functionalities.
And I just opened my vehicle code and started taking a look at the definition, and our definitions key on what, for example, the first definition is autonomous technology. That has an autonomous technology means technology that has the capability to drive a vehicle without the active physical control or monitoring of a human operator. And so the first part is the active physical control. That's the person, they're not in the vehicle, they're not capable of manipulating the pedals or the wheel. But in that situation that we heard described, where the person presses a fob and is standing out and watching, is that sufficient for monitoring? What would the person be able to do to stop the vehicle if something came up?
Let go of the button.
It's just a matter of pressing the fob.
Watch, let go if anything intervenes and you need to stop.
Barbara, they asked you to come to the mic so that you could.
Barbara Wendling, Volkswagen. Yeah, that's the difference. In the case where somebody is standing outside and sort of teleoperating the vehicle via a fob or an app, or they're watching their line of sight, they're holding something down or doing something actively the whole time the car is moving. So they're clearly monitoring, they are clearly responding, doing the object and event detection. If something goes wrong, a kid jumps out, they let go of the button, the car stops. So that's why I would say that's a level 2. It's not an automated vehicle, which starts at level 3, 4, and 5 in the SAE parlance. So,
one thing that I think about, and I have one of those key fobs that unlocks my car from a distance, and it's based on a radio frequency. Should we be concerned when we talk about applications like that by the fact that if you're too far away, it may not, letting go of the button may not work because you don't have the adequate radio signal?
I think that the vehicle manufacturers or companies that design these systems, and they're not all vehicle manufacturers, but they have a high incentive to make sure that these things are designed safely, so that if you were so far away that you couldn't do line of sight, they wouldn't operate, right? So, but I'm not the design engineer, so.
All right, thank you. Any design engineers present? I guess they're just going to leave it all up to us too. We've done a lot of discussion about parking valet and complete stop, a little bit about operator. We don't know what the exact full universe of terms that we may need to define as we get towards operating vehicles that can be sold to an end user or operating outside of a testing mode. And so if, in thinking about this, are there other things that you think we need to be paying attention to? Providing some definitions to that may not already be defined by statute, may not already be reflected in our testing regulations that we should be looking about as we proceed forward. Anyone? Any suggestions? Go ahead, John.
I'm not sure, John Simpson from Consumer Watchdog, I'm not sure if this is the appropriate time to bring it up, but that's the whole question around privacy issues. Is this an appropriate time to bring that up?
Go right ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm speaking on behalf of Consumer Watchdog, a nonpartisan, nonprofit public interest group, to call on the Department of Motor Vehicles to ensure that the regulations you are developing to govern the use of autonomous vehicles popularly known as driverless cars, will protect the operator's privacy. The company most directly affected by the new autonomous vehicle regulations will be Google, I think, which is pioneering development of the robot-driven cars. The internet giant was the driving force behind SB 1298, which charged the DMV with the task of developing these regulations. And they also rebuffed attempts at the time the law was passed to put in some consumer privacy protections. However, we think it's not too late to implement privacy safeguards in this rulemaking, and Consumer Watchdog calls on the DMV to do so. Failure to act will mean substantial privacy risks from the manufacturer's driverless cars technology if there are not protections from what Google is best known for, the collection and use of voluminous personal information about us and our movements. The DMV regulations must give the user control over what data is gathered and how the information will be used. Merely stating what data is gathered with no explanation of its use is woefully inadequate. The DMV's autonomous vehicle regulations must provide the driverless cars gather only the data necessary to operate the vehicle and retain the data only as long as necessary for the vehicle's operation. The regulations should provide that the data not be used for any additional purpose such as marketing or advertising without the consumer's explicit opt-in consent. Without appropriate regulations, autonomous vehicles will be able to gather unprecedented amounts of information about the use of those vehicles. How will that data be used? Just as we are now tracked around the internet, will Google and other purveyors of driverless car technology now be looking over our shoulders on every highway and byway? Will the data be provided to insurance companies for underwriting purposes or to third parties that develop some kind of a driverless score related to where and when individual travel? It won't be about getting from A to B. It'll be all about how we got from A to B and why we got from A to B and, what we're going to be doing along the way. Consumers enthusiastically adopted the new technology of the internet. What we were not told was that our use of the information superhighway would be monitored and tracked in order to personalize corporate marketing and make a fortune for companies like Google. Consumer Watchdog supports driverless car technology, safe driverless car technology, and predicts it will be commonplace sooner than many of us expect. However, it must not be allowed to become yet another way to track us in our daily lives. Internet technology was implemented with little regard to protecting users' privacy. We are playing catch-up for a failure to consider the social impact of a new technology. The time to ensure that this new driverless car technology has the necessary privacy protections is while it is being designed and developed. This is a concept known as privacy by design. It means privacy issues are considered from the very beginning and solutions are baked in. Trying to catch up after a new technology is developed and broadly implemented simply will not work. I call on the DMV to require that consumers must give opt-in consent before any data gathered through driverless car or autonomous vehicle technology is used for any purpose other than driving the vehicle. Thank you.
Got a couple questions. One of the things that the statute requires is that a vehicle have the capability of recording data for 30 seconds prior to a crash, and then storing that data in a read-only format for 3 years after that event. How would that requirement fit in with your concerns with respect to how vehicles collect information? Because there is going to be some valuable information that on the operation of the vehicle. How do you determine how an accident happened? Was there a failure of the software, failure of the operator, a failure of some other equipment on the vehicle? And I think the intent of that requirement is that there'd be an opportunity to find out what indeed happened with respect to that crash. So I guess my question to you is, I heard your concerns about, putting some restrictions on how the vehicles can obtain data, information as it's being operated by a person. What about that balancing thing that we have to have where there's a requirement that the vehicle has to store some data?
The vehicle, as I understand it, has to store data for the 30 seconds prior to a crash, and then it overwrites that.
No, it has to keep it in a read-only format for a period of 3 years after the accident.
After the accident.
Right.
Right. But and I understand the reasons for that. But what we would say is that the data ought not to be continuously collected and used for some other purpose. I mean, you're talking there about a specific collection of data in the event of a crash or serious malfunction. And my understanding is the technology then would only record that if there is such an event.
So it'd be the data specific to the crash.
Precisely.
Okay.
Now, then the question is, all right, if the statute right now says it needs to be retained for 3 years, there needs to be, and I'm not sure that it now exists, but there needs to be some very specific guidelines about who can get access to that data and under what circumstances. And in certain circumstances, I would think it would require a warrant. Or should require a warrant.
If you think about it, a lot of the technology now is based on mapping. You know, the vehicles have to, since they're operating in many functions without a human driver actually controlling it, the technology may be dependent upon maps, and it may be dependent upon those maps constantly being updated. You know, for example, 24th Street here, you know, next to the DMV headquarters, isn't the same every day. You know, a road crew might be out there doing something at some specific period of time. Would the collection of that type of traffic condition information or even mapping information be something that you would be concerned about for a privacy mode? Because I could see how there would be examples that would be valuable information that may need to be collected and shared. You know, there are many things, there are many systems now, for example, where vehicles are monitoring, for example, traffic conditions. You know, what's going on the highway now, and people are actually buying applications that let them know, I might want to avoid this driving scenario now because the information that has been collected by other vehicles demonstrate that there's some issue or some problem there. If what I hear you're saying, that may thwart the ability to have something useful like that.
No, it depends how you are looking at that. I mean, if you are gathering the information only for the use of driving the car, then that would seem to me to be appropriate. It's when the data then is commingled and used in other ways with other things that there would be a problem. And also, I think a lot of that type of data is essentially aggregate data. You know, it doesn't tell, it's not necessary to say which vehicles were in the particular traffic jam that you want to be avoiding. You just, in an aggregate way, know that you don't want to be on the 405 because it's got even more cars than normal. So the car goes a different way. So I think that's appropriate.
So it's more situational, you know, like, for example, I might have a sweet tooth and love to go to See's Candy, and you wouldn't like to see the car collecting that information about me and then somehow providing it to someone such that I start getting ads for See's Candy on my email.
Precisely.
Okay.
And it's some of the organizations that are developing some of this technology have a business of gathering data in all sorts of ways across all of their services and now combine it so that if they then had driving data combined with their email service, with their search service, that offers some very intriguing privacy unfriendly issues, to say the least.
Well, if you think, what about other, not necessarily privacy unfriendly, but actually regulatory friendly issues? For example, I know now our system of insuring vehicles is based on how many miles it drives a year. You know, would you have a problem? That's not I don't know if that necessarily raises a privacy issue, but it would seem that if vehicles would have the ability to record and transmit how far they're driving, wouldn't that have some benefits? For example, figuring out how much to charge for insurance for that vehicle.
It could potentially be used for that, I suppose, but we seem to have a system right now where we're able to estimate that. I'm not sure that a person should be required to, have something monitoring them to report back precisely what the what the mileage was.
Do you have some suggestions as to some specific language that we might want to consider using as we embark on drafting? For example, some standards for privacy, definitions for what we mean by privacy?
Certainly we'll be adding some written comments that would touch on that. But I mean, the general principle is that the data that is gathered should only be used for the driverless car or the autonomous vehicle, call it what we will. There was an interesting comment over the weekend by the president of Volkswagen, who was talking about all sorts, regular cars with black box technology in them now are capable to do all sorts of things in terms of gathering information about how fast you've been going, all that sort of stuff. And there is some concern that that's very privacy invasive. And the president, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something along the lines of that he thinks it's appropriate to use that data to help improve maintenance of a vehicle and for safety issues, but he did not want Volkswagens to become, as he put it, a data monster. And we certainly don't want autonomous cars to be that either. We don't oppose the technology. We think that it is the way it's going to be in the future. We just want to try and make sure that the data is used for that purpose and that purpose alone, unless the operator consents for other things.
Okay. So when you think about an opt-in function, is that something that they opt in when they purchase the vehicle, or is it something that, my car has navigation, and it's got, whenever I go in to start driving it, it has that screen that comes up, and I have to check yes or no. It gives me a warning not to use it when I'm driving. Would that opt-in be something that has to be given once, or is it an opt-in? For example, like I opt in every time I check that box yes, and that map appears on my dashboard. Is that an opt-in that can occur depending on the circumstances, at the choice of the owner of the vehicle or the operator of the vehicle?
I think there's different ways that the opt-in can occur, but you clearly have to understand what it is that you're opting into, and that's one of the big problems. All too often, it's not particularly transparent. Mm-hmm. And certainly, default ought to be that the driverless car works very well and very safely without you opting in to sharing data with anybody else. Now, if for some reason that you found it useful to get all kinds of advertisements showing up on a screen, say, about restaurants that were in the vicinity that you might like to go to, and you wanted to hit a button to do that, well, fine. You should be able to do that.
But many times when you see the types of an opt-in, if I want to buy a song on my iTunes and I have to check this I agree box with a whole, page after page of information, if I don't check the I agree box, I don't get to buy the song. So when you start talking about an opt-in, what happens if you choose not to opt in? Does that leave you without a transportation choice?
Well, we were positing that it would not. That the basic level of the driverless car, autonomous vehicle, robot car technology is that it works and gets you from point A to point B without gathering the data and sharing it for other purposes. And if you want these other things, and if you want the data shared, that would be an additional on top of affirmative opt-in. But the basic functioning of, it's like, my iPad here, I can opt in to having it show my location or not. And in certain times I want it to tell my location, other times I do not. It would be an analogous sort of function. So that I'm using the example of, yes, I want to share my car driving data with everything else that's known about me in the cloud of this particular company that offers email and looks after my calendars and everything else. Sure, and for reasons that make sense to me, I will opt into sharing my driving as well. But it shouldn't automatically go into that cloud of data about me.
Well, when you think about the collecting of data, and I'm just going to kind of like free flow on our agenda. But once you have that collection of data, there also has to be some concerns about the security of it. And what are your thoughts about a concept such as cybersecurity? You know, we often think about it in the realm of somebody hacking and taking control of the vehicle, but what about also making sure not only whether or not you opt in or that you're concerned about the privacy, but how would you suggest about securing that data?
Well, I mean, I was delighted to see that you had the cybersecurity point on your agenda, because I think that's a huge issue, partly from the point of people hacking in, as we've seen in so many other ways over the last 6 or 8 months. And I don't know the extent to what this data could be encrypted, but it certainly would seem to me to be a fairly good idea to be having encrypted transmissions back and forth to wherever it's going, and when the data is ultimately stored someplace else, it would seem to me there ought to be some fairly high standards for encryption. I know a number of the technology companies were appalled by what was done to them by the NSA, although it seemed to me that they really started to push back more when they got a black eye about what happened than they did initially. But they are pushing back now, and I think that they are becoming increasingly cognizant of the cybersecurity problems, and that's a good thing. And I think that it's entirely appropriate to put some regulations into place, both around the transmission of the data back and forth and in terms of ways that it would reside in an encrypted mode in the vehicle and in the cloud that it's stored in.
Okay. Sorry, go right ahead.
John Tillman, Mercedes-Benz. I think we have to do one thing here, separate data collection from data dissemination. You know, we're not really making that distinction here. When we're talking about collecting data, the regulation specifically states, you know, keeping first 30 seconds prior to an accident. But the regulation does not specify how long the data without an accident is required, and it shouldn't. The OEM or the consumer should be able to decide at the end of a trip that data, if no event occurs, the data could and should possibly be deleted from the system, you know, to where it's not necessarily kept in record. And then the next trip, you know, for the length of the trip is kept. But we have to be careful when we're talking about cybersecurity is if a person is able to hack into it, what are they able to get? There are groups, SAE and other groups, working on this particular topic, NHTSA, for example. But we also have to keep in mind is what are they getting? And the regulation should not require us to maintain data for 50 trips that if someone should hack into it, they could get access to that person's entire month worth of traveling. So we have to keep in mind what we're looking at getting, what the regulation is requiring us to keep. It makes sense to keep things related to an accident. It does not make sense for us to keep things in the vehicle related to the last 30, 40, 50 trips. So we need to define that. But specifically, I wanted to make comment regarding collection versus dissemination.
Mm-hmm. Now, is that something that we should be concerned about addressing in the regulations? For example, we know that we have to address the fact that it has to keep the accident data, but we haven't been given a mandate that it has to be able to keep other forms of data. And I hear John's concern is like, well, what about the fact that the vehicle will know a lot about your travel patterns? And should we be concerned about addressing issues of who gets access to that information that the vehicle may have? And is that something that we should be addressing in the regulations? Anyone else? Go right ahead.
Hi, Brian. Steve Psycho from Chrysler.
Oh, Steve.
Just a couple of observations. Sure. This has been a very interesting discussion the last few minutes here about privacy and security and event data recording. And just wanted to try and maybe make a few distinctions. You know, the event data recorders that we have in vehicles today, really that is a very specific purpose, and that is to collect information relevant to the crash for reconstruction purposes, so as you can understand what happened with the vehicle during an event. It carries, you know, maybe about 5 seconds worth of data. That data set is very specific, and it is detailed out in Part 563 of what is collected, how often is collected, and you know what data rate it's collected. And that differs a little bit from, I think, the privacy concern, which is personal information. So you're you know, again, the mapping and so forth, and any type of credit card information, that's all personal information. So I just wanted to make the distinction that, you know, those need to be treated differently. I think there's a very specific purpose for event data recording. You know, as we move into autonomous vehicles, if mapping data and other information that and kind of links the two, we just need to be careful and treat those a little bit differently there.
Right, and I think what we're somewhat in agreement. If you think about it, there is some valuable information to be gleaned from, you know, data that the vehicle collects as it's traveling. I use the example about traffic congestion and the benefits of knowing as different people are various. John used the example of driving on the 405. Wouldn't it be great to know, maybe take another route instead of getting caught in this Sepulveda Pass because the traffic is really bad there? And is that the beneficial use of information that may be collected by the car? I think he was speaking in the realm of, and he stepped out for a moment, but you know, the car collecting information about your habits and somehow marketing that. And you know, should we make a distinction in our regulations, the beneficial uses of data that's collected versus the more marketable uses of data that's collected?
The other thing I wanted to point out is onboard storage versus offboard storage. Event data recorders today, that is onboard. So when you talk about privacy and access to that, that's you know, somebody has to hook up a specific tool to extract that information on an onboard device, as opposed to, you know, zipping it off to the cloud. So there is that distinction there as well that I think needs to be made.
I think another thing we need to be cognizant of is that there are, for some things, there are already existing federal regulations. And one of the certifications that are going to be required is that the manufacturer is going to have to certify that what they've done to the vehicle doesn't somehow make inoperable a federally mandated standard. So I think one of the things that we often also have to think about is we're trying to, on the state basis, regulate this is, are we talking about something that may be preempted by an already existing federal standard?
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Hey, Brian, Dan Frakes with General
I saw you
Motors.
nodding, Dan, so did I steal your idea?
Yeah, well, I do agree with it. One of the things I'd like to offer up to maybe make things a little simpler, you know, both from the auto manufacturers and from DMV's standpoint, is when you look at EDRs or electronic data recorders, you know, there is a federal standard. So I would recommend, you know, having the auto industries and DMV consider that as the guideline to follow regarding this sort of technology, because, you know, as you know, that's likely going to keep evolving and keep improving and having new requirements. So having the industry follow the federal standard is, I think, a simpler recommendation. And then just another thing, when in the outline here, you guys had used the term black box. I would recommend using the term electronic data recorder, because that's what's used in the federal standard.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that discussion about privacy and the use of data?
Barbara Wendling, Volkswagen. I think I'm really sort of just paraphrasing what they said, but I think there's a big difference between, as I said, the crash data, and that data is constantly recorded in volatile memory, meaning nobody can access that while it's being recorded. The only time it gets hard stored into non-volatile memory from which it could be retrieved is after a crash. So there has to be a crash. Otherwise, there is no data to get out of that type of recorder. If you're talking about the other stuff that's wirelessly extracted, maybe going to a cloud, that's a whole different ballpark, but that's not unique to automated vehicles. That's happening today through various wireless media. So arguably, the rules for that either already exist or are being developed, and they would cover autonomous vehicles as they cover vehicles today. So,
when you mention the rules for that, are there some specific rules that we should be taking a look at?
I'm sorry, I'm not an expert in the privacy area. I have just limited knowledge.
Okay,
So,
thank you. Anyone else? Okay. On our agenda, we noted, which is a mirror off of the statute, the mandatory certifications, and you can see under Roman numeral 2, heading number 3, mandatory certifications, there are various things, and instead of black box under G, we'll call it event data recorder. But these are things that the statute requires us to obtain a certification of. And, what we struggle with is that just a simple, check the box, I certify that the vehicle has a mechanism to disengage and that is easily acceptable to the operator, or should there be some standard with respect to that? And if you talk about a standard, then what is that standard? And so for each of those items, those are things that we're going to have to get a certification on. And anytime you talk about a certification, it's like how secure or how much information should we have in order to be satisfied that that certification actually guarantees us or satisfied us that the vehicle is safe. And so what I'd like to open our discussion up for is when we talk about the mandatory certification, what process should the department go to in making itself feel secure such that it can approve an application when someone wants to start selling vehicles that end purchasers can buy and rely on the certifications that we get in that application process. So what I'd like now is your thoughts on, not necessarily on those items, each one specifically, but how would the department go about getting the certifications that are necessary to grant an application to start allowing the operation of vehicles out on the streets? I'm going to open it up for that. Does anyone have any comments on that or any suggestions or even some thoughts about systems that may be already in operation that we can mirror from?
Just a quick thought starter here with this topic, and for the auto industry, typically on many different levels, the industry self-certifies just because of the volume of products that are coming out on the market. And whether it's fuel economy standards or safety standards, I would consider having the DMV look at a self-certification process for the industry.
When we hear self-certification, though, that just seems like we'd have a simple form, and for example, I'll use the first thing that's on our list: a mechanism that engages to disengage that is easily accessible to the operator. Is that just a matter of checking a box? Yes, I have that system, and when we're looking at an application, I go by that certification and go ahead and operate it, or do I need something more substantial to satisfy me that that's something like that there? And I'm only using that one thing as an example.
Yeah, I think that's going to have to go on a case-by-case scenario to evaluate it. Some things could be as simple as that. Just to my previous comments, for example, with fuel economy standards, there's pretty complex tests that take days to run that folks like General Motors do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to probably take more than today to run
Sure.
through those kinds of things, but just my comments.
Anyone else?
Barbara Wendling with Volkswagen. I think the earlier applications will be what we call conditional, so they will be part-time, they will only work in certain limited modes, like we talked about parking mode, or maybe on a freeway in a traffic jam kind of mode. Those things will be pretty seamless from the driver's standpoint. They're not a huge leap in terms of how you operate a vehicle, so would be better not to have too many barriers to ownership put in the way, in terms of certification. So none would be ideal. If you're going to go down the path of special certifications in order for a driver to be able to operate this type of vehicle in traffic, then I think a good analogy might be a motorcycle. The person presents themselves with their vehicle, and you make sure that in normal traffic they can handle
When you
the
mentioned
technology.
that at least in the earlier stages, the technology will be limited. Should the certification be only up to those limits, or should we gather information when you're certifying something? You actually do more of an explanation as to what you're certifying to, what capabilities you're certifying to, so that when we're approving the application, we make sure that we have some prohibitions that it can't be operated maybe outside of what the certifications are.
I don't, yeah, I'm hesitant to think too much on my feet here, but so I invite others to weigh
Yeah.
in, but, yeah.
Go ahead, Ron.
So I think the certifications relate to sort of the, as I'm reading the list here, is more about not kind of the limitations on where the vehicle might operate, but more about whether or not they comply with those things that are in the legislature about the means to disengage and the visual indication, the first two I'm reading there, and a way to alert the driver. Those things seem to be fairly straightforward in terms of you have them or you don't. If there's something particular, about a feature in a certification that would require you to know that there's some specificity in order to judge that makes sense. But for the most part, in my reading of them, they seem to, at least in part, be straightforward. If there's something about the mechanism to disengage that you want to specify, I'm not sure what that would be, but if you did, then you would say that, and then you would certify to it, right? And so the self-certification process. So I think that I would be cautious not to make some of these things more complicated than they are, right? If there's something particular that you believe is necessary for some of these features in order to make them safe, or which I think is what you're concerned with, then you might want to think about specifying that. It's not clear, to me that would always be, say, like a visual indicator in the cabin that the technology is engaged. That would be for the driver. For those cases in which the vehicle has a driver, that they be able to see it. For vehicles that don't have a driver, it's unclear to me why. I mean, I know it's in the legislation, but it's unclear to me why we'd even require this kind of certification if there's no driver in the vehicle. But I think you're just parroting the language that is in the legislation right now. But so I guess my view is, I think it's what Dan said, is that you might want to look at each one individually, but I wouldn't. The self-certification part means that a manufacturer has put in that application and has certified that they meet those requirements, and that anybody failure to produce evidence if you ask for it later, which is kind of what NHTSA does, right? So NHTSA may go out and do something later, but a self-certification really means that a manufacturer is putting in writing that it's legally meeting the obligation that's in the regulation, and so I would that's not a small thing. It's a pretty significant thing. It's kind of the way it works in the U.S. system. So that's kind of my take, is I would only be more specific than what's in the legislation if you think there's something about the need to do it for purposes of safety, and for the most part, I don't see that here, but maybe as you go through it, you'll see it.
Well, there may be some concerns about what's needed for safety. For example, one of the certifications is that the technology meets federal motor vehicle safety standards and performance standards that are in California and federal law. Now, we know that there are no federal motor vehicle safety standards for autonomous technology right now, so that begs the question, since the statute contemplates that they have to meet some standards that may be in California law, our regulation would be a part of California law. So is that something that we should be looking to? And if so, how do we come up with that standard that the autonomous technology is safe?
So so that's, I mean, there is a section later about the standards, right? And I think we have some views about what we think should be done to sort of evaluate the safety performance of autonomous technology that may be different than the ones outlined. I don't know if you want to do that here.
Yeah,
or
we can go ahead.
And do it here?
Sure.
So I mean, I think we really believe that a driver's test of of a technology is probably one of the best ways to evaluate its safety performance. Each company will be doing its own testing. The DMV currently uses a driving test now to evaluate drivers. It seems to me that a driving test that would actually evaluate the technology's performance for the environment that the application indicates that the applicant wants to operate in would be a way and a means by which you could evaluate the safety performance of a technology.
Ron, can I
Yep.
interrupt real quick?
Yep.
Are you suggesting a driver test for the vehicle?
For the
or
vehicle.
For each of the models that a manufacturer would produce?
Yeah, so that's right. So each one in which it would apply for application, I assume that, I don't know how the application would work, but for each application, which could differ by vehicle type and operating environment, that there'd be a test, a driver test of the vehicle to ensure that it could actually perform in the way that the manufacturer claims it's safe to do so. So that would be a way in which we think could be it means, A, that the DMV here in California is used, and most DMVs are used to doing it. It's mostly about the ability of the vehicle, because it's, you know, for the most part, if the things that you're regulating are where the driver does not need to be consciously in the loop. They're either they're not monitoring the vehicle's performance. They're available to come back, be pulled back, or in the case of no driver, that the vehicle by itself can perform all the necessary functions to operate safely in the environment for which it's applying to operate in.
So that would be, DMV would be performing tests of each individual model of a vehicle to basically double check the certifications?
So what I was talking about, we could double check the certifications. I was really talking about down in the safety standards area where you have suggestions about what might be included as a part of the safety standards. Item 3 in your outline, which is why I wondered if we should have waited for this discussion. But there where you're talking about, and we're really jumping ahead about third parties and things, I think we feel that a way in which we would like to see this evaluated as a more basic driving test of the technology.
But if you think about a basic driving test of the technology, and on that we talked about like whether that's something that the DMV itself would be doing, or on our outline we talked about a third-party certifier. Since you know this is a type of industry that we haven't regulated before, and I don't think I can walk across the street and find somebody who knows how to test and the certification of the technology of an autonomous vehicle. So is that something that would be more appropriate to rely on a third party to do? Or should we start developing that expertise in-house?
I'm not sure that you can't do this work, right? It really is about getting into the vehicle with a test driver, a safety test driver, and operating on California public roads in which this vehicle as presumably has been operating on as part of its testing program. And before you would approve an application that it could safely and completely maneuver in the environment that it's applied to do, and on a course that the DMV, for example, would choose, and would be a means by which you could actually verify the safety, help verify the safety performance of the vehicle.
Ralph, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ralph Ong. I'm a private citizen. I also serve on the SAE Automated Vehicles Committee. In line with the comments that Ron just made, I think one thing that you could also consider is in this method of testing, that you look at testing maybe just perception and path planning aspects. The idea here is that, you know, the burden of testing could be a financial burden, you know, on the state and on the DMV. And you might want to look at testing those aspects of the vehicle's capabilities that are particularly challenging in this type of technology. So I would propose that you consider looking at that aspect of it as perhaps a method of testing.
Well, one thing that you mentioned is the cost associated with something like that, and is that something that we ask, we try to bear, or is that something that should be reflected in the cost of applying to, applying to us under the statute to start operating the vehicles? Since before we can grant the application, we have to, if we went on this model, we'd have to do the testing. There would be some costs associated with that, and that's something that we should be recovering.
There are different ways to do it, but in the end, if there's cost, then someone has to bear it, whether it's the state or the consumers who end up having to purchase the vehicles, or the companies that are doing the development, which in the end pass that cost down. So I think the idea is overall to try and keep costs in a manageable area. So as a whole, the industry and as consumers in the state, we don't create excessive cost adders, if you will.
No, I was just going to say, it seems like, first of all, the burden for testing, this would be a test that was conducted on public roads with a safety driver on a, whatever route is decided to be given. And that doesn't seem like a significant resource burden. Currently, I guess California requires some fee for doing this today. So that model seems like a reasonable model. I don't know.
Akin to the test that you would take when you come to get a driver's license.
Yeah, that's kind of the notion, right? Now we're really testing the vehicle's capability to do what the manufacturer has applied to be able to do based on its work. And so, yeah, in that domain, it seems to be analogous to kind of what you do today, although it's about the vehicle's performance.
Right. So if you look back at the things that are certified,
Yeah.
now having to flip over the page. For example, the mechanism to disengage that's easily accessible to the operator, or a visual indicator in the cabinet that the technology is engaged, or a system to safely alert the operator that there's a technology failure. In that basically drive test mode, you'd be able to visually see that all
Yeah.
of those things there, and you wouldn't necessarily just have to rely on
That's
them.
right. That's possible. Yeah, that's right. That's right. That could be done easily in that way.
Okay, thank you.
John Tillman, Mercedes-Benz. Items 1, 2, and 6 here seem to apply directly to an application to operate a vehicle, whereas the others, 3, 4, and 5, seem more like an application to sell the vehicle within the state. You've got certifications that you have to meet in order to sell that vehicle. If you aren't certified to meet those functionalities, you can't sell that vehicle. So we have to separate this application, and the test functionalities, basically, if a person's applying just like you when you apply to drive a heavy-duty vehicle in the state, you have certifications for the kind of load, hazardous load, liquid loads, other loads. So if a person is applying for a regular driver's license, they have endorsements added to it. You have an endorsement. If you're also applying for the ability to operate an autonomous vehicle, you have to know, how do you have an emergency shut-off? Do you know how to shut off the vehicle in an emergency? Do you know how to bring it to a safe stop? If you get a notification that the system is shut down. So we need to separate out what we're talking about application. Application for operation of the vehicle by the driver, or application to sell the vehicle, and have you met certifications, or do you have valid certifications to do that for the different operations?
Unfortunately, they're almost the same thing, because if you think about it, once you do that application, I couldn't imagine that manufacturers are just going to be producing vehicles that only they will operate. And so we have to go from a mode of thinking that at some point some vehicles are going to be sold. And so when we get to this application process, before you're going to be able to start selling the vehicles, you'd have to have gone through this application process. And so when we start thinking about it, the things that we want to be assured of is that for the end user operator, the vehicle is safe. And I think that's why the statute requires all those certifications, because it's not just the fact that the manufacturer is now driving the vehicles on the road, but someone who is not part of the manufacturing process would be able to operate those vehicles on the roads.
I'm sorry, but I see the distinction here. I don't see where the manufacturer is necessarily having to require a proof of insurance or indication whether the vehicle is operated with or without a driver. Yeah, I can see the vehicle can be operated with or without a driver, but we're talking two different applications. In my mind, the driver has to come to DMV and show that they know how to operate this system, the autonomous driving system. That's separate than the certification that the car can be operated autonomously. So there's safe operation of the vehicle, and that's on the driver, that he knows how to operate the vehicle safely. Shouldn't be on the OEM to certify that the driver can operate it safely. There has to be a certain learning curve of the consumer when they purchase the car.
Who's going to be responsible for making sure that the consumer has been adequately informed about that learning curve? Is it going to be the dealer's responsibility? Is it the manufacturer's responsibility that's introducing the technology?
Well,
and how are we going to know that that the consumer has been given adequate information about the capabilities of the vehicle that they're purchasing?
Go ahead. Okay. Well, just like we provide a manual for a car, and how many of us in this room actually have read the entire manual You know, well, there are different functionalities of a car you've had for a year or 2 years that, oh, I didn't know it could do that. We sell the customer a vehicle, and it has, they purchase it knowing it has this capability, but at some point, DMV has to know that the consumer understands how to operate it. We can only go so far. We can only train the consumer so far how to operate that vehicle. But we can't train them for all modes that might come up. In an emergency situation, if there's a truck on your right side and there's a car on your left, you know, and it isn't operating properly, we can't give them information how to operate the vehicle in every single scenario. So the DMV has to somehow be involved in at least knowing the consumer knows how to operate the vehicle in emergency situations. Just some basic questions. Can you turn your vehicle off, your system off, your AV system off? Can you bring the vehicle to the side of the road if it's shut down in some way? But then there's another concept of if in a completely autonomous vehicle, we're not quite there, but a vehicle is completely autonomous and the person sitting in the back seat is not a licensed driver. You know, that's another situation much farther down the road that with a licensing, an application for a license doesn't come into play. So we have to separate, in my mind at least, what is considered an application to operate the vehicle versus an application to sell the vehicle on the road. And the two aren't necessarily the same.
Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, I liked what Ron was saying about this being analogous to a driver's test, and I think he's made some good points as well. And it seems to me that what you ought to be contemplating is essentially road testing the technology like you would do a driver's test and making it perform, show that it can perform in the environment that it claims to be able to do it. But I'm also beginning to think that once that technology has been checked out and certified by the DMV, before someone gets to be an operator, they have to go and buy the car, and then they have to take a driver's test in the car. Just like when I, as a driving, I get a special license to drive an autonomous vehicle. It could be an endorsement, just like being able to drive a big rig or something like that. So there's two distinctions there. One, you want to be testing the technology and certifying that, and a road test is completely appropriate. And the point about you want to know that the person who is responsible for running the car, whatever we call that, I don't know if you call it driving it, but that they get some kind of a license, and the way they demonstrate that they can do it is they take a road test in the car they're going to be driving.
Well, as I'm thinking about that, and I'm trying to go at the practical, how would that work?
Just like you take a road test now to get a driver's license.
Right, but before you could operate that vehicle with whatever capability that the autonomous technology has in it that we would be testing you on, you would have already have to have invested in purchasing that vehicle with that additional technology. And what if you fail?
Well, you get a learner's permit and your dad's bought you a car and you fail the driving test, you can't drive it for a while. You go back and take it again. It's a very analogous situation. You'd buy the car, you get a learner's permit, which, gives some inducement to the people who's selling it to you to get you trained, and then when you think you're ready within a certain amount of time, you go take a driver's test.
Okay.
So
Now,
Brian, one of the things that I think I like the idea of separating these two because they are separate, right? The idea about in those systems in which there's a driver that needs to be pulled back into the transition of manual driving, I would think as a part of the application, you would ask a manufacturer to be specific about whether or not there was training needed to safely operate this technology before it could be sold and made available to the public. And if the answer is yes, then the question would have to be answered to who does that and how do you ensure that that can be done in a way that satisfies the department about doing it. If they say no, then they should provide a rationale and judgment and a statement about why the answer is no and what data they have to support no. And that would go a long way, I think, to sort of trying to figure out, does this technology really require training? And if so, who would do it and how would it get done that would satisfy it? But doesn't put the burden on the department of having to figure out, who should do it. You would evaluate that information and decide whether or not there's some contingencies on the application approval that may have to be met in order to do it. But it seems like that would be a first start as a part of the application process.
And so it would be to submit some additional information that, when you're applying as a manufacturer to start having your vehicles allowed to be operated on the road.
Right.
That you would provide some additional information about what skill sets need to be imparted to and whether or not you've addressed that.
Yes, and or if the answer is we don't believe, and we've evaluated the need for training for this system and found that it's not needed, and here's the reasons we say that, or that in fact there is a training component, and the way that we recommend that training be done is, whatever the manufacturers suggest, because a driver's if there is a need for a driver's test, it implies there's a need for training, right? And if there's a need for training, the question is who's going to conduct the training? Does it happen by the manufacturers through their dealerships, or does it happen in some other way? But I think that should be resolved at the application stage.
Okay. Because, the additional item that we have on our outline, and we talk about whether or not there needs to be some special driver licensing requirements for the end users. We listed subjects like written tests, drive tests, how to test when vehicles have different capabilities, because a car that's made by Volkswagen may not be able to do the same thing that a car that's made by GM may be different from what Mercedes would put out or what Chrysler could put out, and any one of them may have vehicles with various levels of capabilities, and you can see how, as a regulator, that might be problematic for us because we won't know. Or should we be gearing up to have basically different types of tests based on the type of technology that's there, and how do we satisfy
I guess I would
ourselves?
caution it. I don't know whether it's necessary or not, but right now, there's no test for adaptive cruise control, blind spot indication, cross traffic, alert. All the technologies that are on vehicles today that are active safety technologies, there is not a training requirement, and I think, and maybe all consumers don't know exactly how to use those, but currently there's no requirement. And the question is the change to this technology in which a driver needs to be transitioned back into the manual driving mode a step above what's required for current active safety technology? If the answer is no, then I presume that that you wouldn't require anything different unless you believe that those also should be regulated in some way.
Well, if you think about it, as you're starting to introduce it, should we be concerned about the fact that we have inexperienced drivers who may be cutting their teeth on technology that does more of the driving for them and basically not developing the driving skills? Is that something that we should be concerned about?
The question is, are you concerned about it today with the technologies that I just mentioned with those new drivers?
Well, for example, if we get a kid that comes up and takes a test and we tell them to parallel park the car, we're going to make them parallel park the car.
Yeah.
Don't press that button that makes the car parallel park it, or you're going to get a big failed a safe operating maneuver. So.
Right. So I don't know the answer. I don't have the perfect answer to your question. I just think that you should try to make sure that the notion of having some additional burden is related to the safety need about that. That's all. And if some manufacturer produces a really good consumer interface for getting transition back into manual that's really intuitive and can be done easily, and they can demonstrate that, then that may actually be better than what we have today for some of the features that I just mentioned, right? So I would be careful about any kind of broad stroke about the need for it, that's why I think this individual submission about what the manufacturer has determined might be an appropriate way. That's my thinking on it anyway.
Well, what do you think about in addition to the testing of the drive test of the vehicle, a drive test of the driver? Does the driver have the requisite skill in operating the type of vehicle that they brought in?
So that's what I was just talking about, right? So I think the best party to make a determination about whether that's necessary may in fact be the manufacturer of the technology, who's going to have evaluated all of those types of needs, and to ask them that question and to have a reasoned basis for their assertion in the application about whether or not they do or do not need it.
Barbara Wendling, Volkswagen. I just want to reinforce what Ron's saying, that especially the earlier application, should be pretty seamless and probably will not require any training. And frankly, we as manufacturers wouldn't want new barriers to entry for these drivers. So, again, on a case-by-case basis, you can say this really doesn't require. For example, what they're calling a traffic jam pilot or traffic jam chauffeur. The vehicle will creep along in its lane in dense traffic on a limited access freeway. You probably don't need special training to use that application. May get dicier if you're talking about a closed campus shuttle that does everything by itself, right? But that has to be discussed, I think, with the manufacturer.
Thank you. Manola Platine with the Personal Insurance Federation. I think this has been a great discussion. I just have a brief comment on the operator licensing part. I think we share everybody's view, including Consumer Watchdog's view, that we, have to make sure that these drivers are, able to operate the cars. But the only thing we'd caution is, to the extent that the DMV doesn't create a special class of license, and that's just because when you go through the insurance underwriting process, that can really complicate and confuse things when you create a different class. There might be different endorsements, different tests that, verify that, but, at least at the beginning, when these cars are likely to be have both modes available, a separate class of license doesn't make sense to us.
And why would that be so?
Well, from the standpoint that this technology will be, phasing in, the cars will be able to be driven as normal cars by normal drivers under, rules we have today. And then again, it's the complexity of the insurance system that when you go to underwrite, it is it's a different level of inquiry that you need to make with a different class of license. And, to the extent that these cars are truly different classes, maybe that makes sense. But a lot of what we're seeing today is it's a development of technology that's already been involved in the auto manufacturing world for, quite some time.
But I guess I'm trying to understand why would, if we designated a specific class of a license that you'd have to operate what would be a private passenger auto, how does that change the definition of the vehicle for the purposes of insurance?
Well, I guess I would ask the question, would that mean that people would have two classes of licenses if they have one autonomous vehicle in their home and then one normal car? I mean, there becomes a challenge at a certain point to get that insurance, and we haven't really even gotten to that stage of, what products are available and whatnot, and we're not there yet. But, that was just a comment from the clients that definitely confuses and complicates the underwriting process to add a new class of license.
And I guess I'm trying to see it because for example, right now, if I if I drive a commercial truck and I have the license that allows me to drive a commercial truck, I also can drive a private passenger auto.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just trying to understand what they will basically be operating. It's not stepping up in a different class of vehicle.
First of all, when you talk about commercial, that wouldn't be under your personal lines policy, so that would be a different insurance product that you're covered.
Right, but
Right.
you would be buying an insurance product that would be covering a private passenger vehicle that can operate in an autonomous mode.
So
And
the concept would be this license would subsume the lower Class C license, and then anyone with this license would have, I'm just not sure how it would work.
I don't know. I guess right now what you're looking at is how many miles somebody drives a year, how many years they've been licensed, and whether they've been involved in any accidents or DUIs. And so since that's what you're looking at right now, I don't understand how a different class of a driver's license to operate a private passenger vehicle would impact your insurance rate.
I did say it would impact the rate. I said it would impact the underwriting process, but I'll get back to you on the practical.
I guess,
aspects of it.
and I'm just playing devil's advocate here, if I come to you, and California's a take-all-comer state, and I bought a private passenger automobile, I'm a good driver, and I bought this car that has these capabilities, I would think that you don't have the opportunity in your underwriting to decline me coverage.
It's not about declining coverage. It's just about the way that the coverage is matched with the person. And so I think, what I'll do is follow up with you and get you, it's more of a technical IT process problem than a practical, we don't think these people should have a license or we would not want to underwrite them.
Okay.
It's just more of a systems issue that can develop.
Okay, because I'm kind of like missing that
Okay.
link. Thank you.
Hey, Brian, separate from that discussion, but the idea that I buy Model A from manufacturer Y that is regulated by California that has a driver, and then I get this endorsement, I sell that vehicle, and I get another vehicle manufactured by, manufacturer Z and model B, does that endorsement good, or do I have to take another test because the technology may be sufficiently different? And
Or even add to your example, you live in a
Yeah.
household that has 3 cars, and all
Yeah.
of them are different manufacturers with
Right.
different capabilities. Do I have to take a test
For
in
all of
each
them.
one of those
Yeah,
vehicles?
yeah.
And does everyone in my household that has a vehicle have to take a test? So that's where you start seeing
The
kind of the
snowball
practical
effect. Yeah,
problems
yeah.
with taking that approach, is
Yeah.
that we would not, it starts getting unwieldy.
Yeah.
What would the impact be that if I showed up at the airport and rented a car that is
Yeah.
different than the technology that I took a test on?
Yeah, yeah.
Does it have to be disabled for me, and can we require that it be disabled? And those are all, and that's what the beauty of having a workshop like this is, because we can start fleshing out and actually brainstorming and all of those types of issues. Anyone else? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to remind people that are watching us over the internet, a number of you are posting on Twitter that you're watching, and if you do want to comment, please go ahead and tweet to @CA_DMV and use the hashtag #DrivingChange. And then also, there's a number of you watching on Google+, and if you, and some of you are submitting questions. If you can, please phrase them in the form of a comment and submit them, and we'll consider those. Thank you.
One of the certifications that we mentioned on page 2 of the outline under Roman numeral 2 mandatory certifications is something that deals with the evidence of testing. We're operating under the assumption that not everyone may apply to us to get a testing license and then or a testing permit, I'm sorry, and then testing the vehicles in California. How should we handle the situation where all of the testing of the technology may occur someplace else when we get to that application process now for operation? The thought being the statute gives us the authority to making sure that the testing that occurred somewhere else was done consistent with the standards that we develop in our regulations. And how should we satisfy ourselves when we get an application that someone has conducted testing, especially if it's not something that we permitted, that may have occurred someplace outside of California? Because that is probably something that you're going to have to look for in an application. It's required by the statute. And if any of the manufacturers who may not be contemplating testing in California have some thoughts about that, I'd welcome you to come forward now. Okay, they're going to be happy to see that.
I think John has some.
Okay, go ahead, John.
I've got a thought about that. I mean, that would seem to me would work just like what Ron was suggesting. If Nissan does all its testing in Japan, when they apply, they would have to road test in the conditions that they're claiming the car would work, and presumably also give you all sorts of supporting documents about the extent of it, but they would still have to do a road test, essentially, of the technology.
And so we would be participating in a road test of that vehicle when they come in to apply for the...
Which would be much less rigorous than the testing that's done here, perhaps. I mean, but it would be the same sort of a road test that would be done for any manufacturer's technology that was claiming that it could operate in a certain environment, I would think.
Thank you.
John, what about your thoughts of if the regulations in a different jurisdiction, say another state, are different for testing these vehicles than they are in California, and do not have the same reporting requirements that we would have here? Any thoughts on that difference?
So hypothetically, you're thinking that they would have much lower standards
In terms of reporting?
in terms of reporting? I'm not sure how to deal with that, frankly. I'm thinking and not fast enough.
Go ahead, Steve.
Hi, Steve Psycho from Chrysler. As an automaker, I think we are big proponents of harmonization, whether it's by a state level, province level, nationally, or globally. So whenever we can develop vehicles that meet requirements across the board, then I think we're better off. When we start getting into different jurisdictions and having to design specifically or even operate or just do our paperwork, for example, differently for different states. That becomes difficult for us. So we would advocate for some harmonization across that level. I guess a question for you, are you working with other states? Are you working with DOT to, are you having those kind of conversations about requirements?
Well, DOT is on our statewide steering committee, so they've seen, and we're talking about federal, they've seen what we're proposing. They get copies of, they're actually part of the discussions that go along as we're developing the regulations. The American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators has a group that are of other states, but it seems like right now, other than Nevada, we're probably the one that's farthest along with the development of regulations. Others are kind of looking to what are you doing? We don't have the capacity to force upon another jurisdiction to adopt the standards that we would have. I think that's why the statute generally talks about reflecting federal motor vehicle safety standards. But we do know right now there's that hole that we are probably farther along in developing, the regulations than we're seeing that are coming from that federal level. I don't know. Maybe once we start doing this in other states and maybe mimic what we do, that we'll see something on that front. But our ability to harmonize what another state does is pretty limited, other than what they do voluntarily.
Yes, understood. I'm just hoping that conversation is ongoing.
Yeah, and Steve, those conversations are happening, as Brian said. The jurisdictions that see this on the horizon and also the jurisdictions that have had legislation passed are in discussions with us and are very interested in how we're proceeding along. So we do have those conversations, but again, as Brian said, we're very limited in terms of what their final product is going to do. And so we can only influence up to a certain point.
Sure, and then obviously NHTSA has a role in harmonizing that as well.
Okay.
Okay.
John Tillman, Mercedes again. To the idea of harmonization, Nevada has, of course, their own rules and regulations for autonomous driving. California will have its own rules and regulations. I don't think we want to get in a situation where our regulations in California are so different from Nevada's that a vehicle that is driving autonomously coming from Nevada is not able to operate in California. So there's got to be some effort to make sure that the vehicles that operate there can operate here, at least with states bordering us. So you are making that, if I presume, to validate the vehicles there and here.
Well, I guess the issue for us is that we're charged with determining what we believe is safe for conditions in driving in California. I don't know necessarily what process Nevada went through to determine what they saw as safe for driving in Nevada. So the one thing that I can say is we always take very seriously the charge of, we have an obligation to make a determination of what we believe is safe here. I often use I've heard many times people use the phrase race to the bottom. We don't necessarily have to start recognizing something that another state may have done if we don't believe that it promotes what we believe is our safety message. So yes, we've looked at what the regulations that are developed in Nevada, and to the extent that we may be doing something different, it's basically based on a determination that we made under our statute. It's required for us to do that. Go ahead, Barbara.
Barb, one thing, Volkswagen, I think when you're talking about vehicle manufacturers, it's a very mature industry, hyper-regulated, for many, many decades. I really have no worries that anybody in the industry is going to put an unsafe product into California or any other state. So maybe the concern then isn't the traditional automakers. Maybe you're worried about a bright high school student saying, I'm going to develop a robot that drives cars and skip college and make my wad and get out. And then if that's the case, maybe you need to look at a different type of rule than really onerous certification requirements. Just a thought.
I guess the issue for that bright high school student is, are they going to be able to come up with the $5 million in insurance to be able to get that car out on the road? I mean, so there are some barriers to entry that are built into the law. Yeah. Is there a comment? Okay. You know, we did a lot of discussion about the operator knowledge and skills, and we actually had started touching upon the certifications that are required. We did a little bit of talking about manufacturer self-certifications. You know, under item 4 on page 3 of the outline, it talks about what possibly additional certifications, that the technology has been programmed to obey all traffic laws. We did a little discussion earlier about the technology has some cybersecurity protections. I think I'd like to focus on that because, you know, one of the biggest things that we regulate as the Department of Motor Vehicle is the obedience to traffic laws, and we keep records, and insurance companies rely on the records that we keep. And one of the things that we're really concerned about is who's responsible when an autonomous vehicle doesn't obey traffic laws, and how do you program a vehicle to obey, and who, you know, we use the example before, who gets the points. And we even saw a comment in a different medium yesterday that what do you mean by obey all traffic laws? Because, for example, who drives at 55 mile an hour on a California highway? If you program the car to go 55, is it now going unsafe for the prevailing conditions? And so how do we go about making sure that the vehicles themselves are programmed in a manner, not necessarily how people operate, but are consistent with the law? And so I'd like to open up for comments on that.
So one of the benefits of having the driver's test is actually also evaluating the vehicle's ability to meet that certification that's required. So how does it do obeying the traffic laws during the test, which is kind of what you do now, right, in part. So we think that that's one way in which you can sort of understand whether the certification, you know, you'll have a certification from the manufacturers, and you'll also be able to evaluate during the driver's test in part, at least.
Okay. So it'd be basically just like we do when we take a newly licensed driver out, we treat the vehicle the same way.
Yeah, and in a variety of different situations in which it would show that it would can meet the traffic safety laws.
Now, one example that we often come back to when we speak to you was an example that we had saw with
we know
some members of the Highway Patrol.
I can't believe you're bringing that up.
You give me a chance, I will. And it was interesting because they had seen in a video a vehicle when it was making a left turn. It had pulled into the intersection and then made the left turn. And of course, some of our friends from the law enforcement field got a little. I don't know if they were upset, more than concerned about that, because of course, that's the way I do my left turn, and then I find out from their reaction that that's not the legal way to do a left turn. And so how do we know that for any individual traffic maneuver that it does? For example, I'm not sure we would be able to test every different traffic scenario unless we had a very complex test of the vehicle when we brought it in.
Yeah, and I think that the companies, I know for our company, we're spending a lot of time. We're aware of the attention that one issue has gotten, and we are taking a lot of steps to make sure that we obey the traffic laws and the way the vehicle is being programmed to operate. So, and I think that, you know, if you look at every traffic law, and there's many, and some of them, you know, there's some flexibility there in terms of what you do. But I think we're working hard to make sure that we do all of them correctly, and we're prepared to certify by the time we apply to operate that we've done that.
All right, I'm looking at the clock, and it's about 10 minutes to 12 now. We still have some items to cover on our agenda. So at this time, I think it would be a good time for us to take a lunch break and then come back. You want to come back at 1?
We'll do it at 1 o'clock.
And then come back at 1 o'clock and resume. So again, the restrooms are right outside, and then we'll just resume promptly at 1 o'clock. Thank you.